Hey, it's Nancy Miller, the creator and host of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. This is a 20-minute teaser of the latest bonus episode. If you like this sample of this episode, you can hear the whole thing by becoming a paid subscriber. As you likely know, Dead Sleep is 100% independent and ad-free. I pretty much make this show myself. So your support supports my work, and hopefully my work supports you by helping you relax and listen to a good story with no loud ads, no gore, and no 911 calls. So if you like what you hear, you can subscribe via Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. There's a free month on Apple Podcasts, a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Thank you again so much for listening. Good evening and welcome back to Dead Sleep. It's Nancy, of course. And this is the June 2025 bonus episode. Thank you so much for subscribing, and the best way to honor your investment in this podcast is just to get started. And we're going to kick things off. A little bit of mental calisthenics to fatigue the mind. A bit of history and context for tonight's episode. One that is, in its own twisted Dead Sleep way, a belated celebration of Women's Health Awareness Month, which was technically in May. But tonight's episode features a story about a woman whose mental health made international headlines. A woman who would be at the center of one of the first and most momentous legal battles to ever take place here in the United States. And at the center of this battle, there would be a married couple. A man who swore his wife was dangerous and delusional, and his wife who swore she was completely sane. And a decision, a diagnosis, that would turn her once safe and secure life into a brutal fight for her own survival. This episode is from one of the first ever accounts of a woman who was forcibly committed into a mental institution by her husband. And that woman's name is one I feel like we should know. Elizabeth Packard. And it's a name and a story I stumbled upon by happenstance. I was intrigued to find out who essentially invented the genre of the mental health memoir. And like you probably, I knew the greatest hits, the stuff from the 20th century. Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar, Girl Interrupted. And of course there was The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, all the way back in the late 1800s. One of the most classic and seminal works of horror fiction about a woman's nervous breakdown, which was more or less based on true events. After the writer, that's Charlotte Perkins Gilman, was prescribed a rest cure from her doctor after she'd had a baby. And back in the late 1800s, a rest cure was exactly that. One was essentially locked in a room, alone, with no books, no pen and paper, nothing to do, nothing to see, nothing to stimulate the mind. The prescription, the demand, was that a woman had to just be there, alone, with nothing but her thoughts. Depriving all of those thoughts of oxygen until they dried up and went away. Looking back, that's a pure and simple recipe for madness. And it's certainly no treatment for what was potentially postpartum depression suffered by the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman at that time. And one of the reasons why she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper was in protest of her treatment by a renowned psychiatrist whose rest cure would also be prescribed, so to speak, to another famous writer, Virginia Woolf, who, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, did not respond well to this treatment. And then, of course, there's the famous saga of Nellie Bly, the New York investigative journalist who, in the late 1800s, went undercover, posing as a mentally ill patient to make her way into a New York asylum, where she spent a harrowing 10 days and wrote about it for the New York newspaper, a series that would go on to be a book and an experience that would make her famous and exposed, for the first time, at least in New York, the unbearable circumstances and inhumane treatment of patients at these hospitals. But the story of Elizabeth Packard, it's unique. One, because it was years before these other works were published. Elizabeth Packard, her saga, it starts in 1860, right around the time of the Civil War, roughly 20 to 30 years before Nellie Bly and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. What's more, Elizabeth Packard wasn't a professional writer. She wasn't a journalist. She was a housewife, an OG Tradwife, living in a small town in Illinois, living an ordinary life. A woman who was not looking for nor asking for help with her mental health, because, in her mind, she was completely sane. Until one day, everything changed. And the story of what happened to Elizabeth Packard was so unbelievable, I wasn't sure if it was even real, until I came across an incredible book, historical nonfiction about Elizabeth Packard, that came out in 2021 by a writer named Kate Moore. You may know Kate Moore's work from a book she published called Radium Girls. But this book dedicated to Elizabeth Packard is titled The Woman They Could Not Silence. And again, it's a wonderful book, a real page-turner, and I read it in one sitting. And I'm drawing certain details from that tonight, along with the usual dead sleep detours and details to fatigue your mind as you fall asleep. And in this story, we will see what life was really like for the original traditional housewives from that era. For the OG Tradwives, the ones in the 1800s, it wasn't a lifestyle. It was a life sentence. That the legal side of these old traditional roles meant a woman did not have a right to participate in society. Financially, politically, she had no personal liberty. It's a world where tradition meant a man owned a woman, from her money to her property to her mind. It was a world where a woman could be locked up indefinitely for the moral crime of thinking, having her own thoughts. And the stigma against someone who was labeled insane was profound, devastating, ruinous, and dangerous. Especially a middle-class lady like Elizabeth Packard, whose reputation in her small Illinois town was as impeccable as her fine clothing and spotlessly clean home. In the summer of 1860, Elizabeth appeared to have it all. At 43 years old, she had 6 healthy children, 5 boys and 1 girl. And like most busy mothers, it wasn't often Elizabeth had a moment, like a real quiet moment, when everything was just perfect and calm. A time where, as a mother, she could recognize and appreciate her many blessings. And it just so happened this one morning, June 18th, would be a day that she'd remember for a very long time, as she snuggled in her giant cozy bed with one of her 6 children. The second youngest child, a dark-haired 5-year-old boy named Georgie. He was a little boy who bathed in the love of his mother and loved nothing more than to curl up and cuddle with her, soft and content as a fuzzy little kitten. That morning, he was grateful to have her full attention. Usually, she would have her baby, the toddler, just 18 months old, Arthur, in her arms, and surrounded by her other younger children, Samuel, age 7, and her only daughter, Libby, age 10. And then there were her teen sons, Isaac and Theophilus III, who they called Toffee, somewhere out there playing and roaming in the vast expanse of the plains of the Middle West. Far away from Elizabeth's home state of Massachusetts, and far removed, at least at that time, from the discord happening in our young country, a rift between the North and South, with rumblings of a possible civil war. All of that seemed far away, at least that morning, because Elizabeth's more imminent threat was closer to home. Her husband, Theophilus Packard. The reason why she had so much space for all her children in the mornings was because Theophilus, her husband, had announced a few weeks ago, sometime in May of 1860, that he no longer wanted to share their marital bed, and he opted to sleep in another room, alone. But even before that dramatic announcement, she'd noticed his behavior changing towards her recently. He was agitated with her, and Elizabeth felt like she couldn't say a single word without causing him some kind of grief. Elizabeth did have an intensity about her. Physically, she was a compact 5'1", but with an expansive personality that drew people to her. She was from New England and had the English pale skin, a wide forehead, and features that one would have called handsome back then. Enhanced by her dark eyes and dark hair, which she wore in a severe part straight down the middle, softened by shoulder-length curls on each side of her ears. Even in old photos and drawings, there was a confidence to Elizabeth, the look of a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Elizabeth had always done what was asked of her, with an unerring compass for what was best and most appropriate in any given situation. Even the biggest decision of her life, her decision to marry her husband, Theophilus Packard. Over the past 20 or so years, Elizabeth had devoted her life to Theophilus, and she loved him in the way that a wife was supposed to love a husband: love, honor, and obey. Even if their courtship and marriage was achieved by Elizabeth's love and honor and obedience to another man, her father. When she and her now husband were in the courtship stage, Elizabeth wasn't even sure if Theophilus liked her all that much. There was, of course, the age difference. He was 15 years her senior. She was 22, and he was 37. but she agreed to marry him because that's what made her father happy. And throughout most of their union, Elizabeth had made it her job, as his wife, to make him happy. She was a good girl from a good family, and that was what she was trained more or less to do. Her satisfaction with herself was derived from her husband's satisfaction with her. And after bearing all these children and keeping a lovely home, one would think, after 20 or so years, Theophilus would have been satisfied. If Elizabeth felt remorse about marrying Theophilus, she didn't show it. Elizabeth was as bright and cheerful at 43 as she was at 23. But now, as Theophilus dourly inched his way towards 60, he only had grown dustier and more ornery. Theophilus was the type of man that if he saw a rose in full bloom in spring, instead of stopping to admire its beauty, its color, its scent, he would note that it was only a matter of time before all those petals would fall away and the bloom would be lost, replaced by death and decay. His outlook even reflected his own looks. His once bright red, curly hair, now fading to a sallow yellow, like a stack of dry hay resting upon his head. Elizabeth knew things weren't going well in their marriage. Even if their relationship wasn't a love match, they used to see eye to eye on some crucial things. Back in Massachusetts, they were both public supporters of the abolitionist movement and were vehemently anti-slavery, and unambiguously supported the North, the Union side, should there ever really be a civil war, which everyone hoped wouldn't happen. What's more, back in Massachusetts, Theophilus was aware of Elizabeth's interest in the burgeoning women's rights movement. He'd even joined her at the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, years earlier. And back in Massachusetts, they would have lively debates about the role of women in society. And then they moved to Illinois, and his perspective changed. By then, Theophilus was a Presbyterian minister, and he'd moved the entire family to this village in Illinois so that he could serve the community there. And while he was the leader, she was the star. Over time, it would be apparent that Theophilus was envious of his own wife. And over time, he exerted his control over her, slowly but surely, in an effort to keep her down and put her in her place. For Elizabeth, it was life in a corset. He'd constrain her emotionally, financially, socially. And just as soon as she'd adjust to that constraint and try and relax and live her life, Theophilus would find a way to constrain her even tighter. He controlled everything, as was his legal right, from her finances to her friendships. And this included when she was allowed to leave the house, rarely if ever alone, along with opening and reading all of her personal correspondence. And at first, when Elizabeth was young, she looked at his controlling behavior as a sign, perhaps, of his love for her, misguided but genuine affection. Maybe that he loved her so much that he wanted to protect her, even from herself. But over the years, Elizabeth had come to realize it wasn't affection that guided his actions, but a contempt he harbored against her. That she was too shiny and too bright in their community, and by comparison, she made Theophilus look even more lifeless and drab. She was like a shiny copper penny, and he was a rusty old nail. There was tension, always tension, that Elizabeth felt that it was her responsibility to solve, until she decided it wasn't. Ever since that first women's rights meeting in Seneca Falls, Elizabeth had been inspired by women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, kind of the Gloria Steinem of that time. And who knows, maybe it was because she'd done her duty as a wife and mother for so many years and was now in her 40s, that Elizabeth decided she had had enough of being the good girl. She wanted to be an individual, a person who had the same rights as her husband as an American. That the Constitution should read that all men and women were created equal. And of course, she was far from alone with this demand. By 1860, as the women's movement gained traction, Theophilus, like many men at that time, was threatened by it, all the while thinking the whole thing silly. And for him, a preacher, it was embarrassing that his wife would be so vocal about it. It was absurd for women to ever see themselves as equal to men in anything: intellect, character, ingenuity, strength, impact. And he no longer took any pleasure in debating this with his wife. As a preacher in a small town, Theophilus needed Elizabeth to set a good example to all the other wives and basically pipe down about all this women's rights business. But Elizabeth was fired up about it, in a way that Theophilus would later claim was more than curiosity. His wife appeared to be suffering from obsessive thoughts. She was becoming hysterical. His proof of this was obvious to anyone who heard her talking about God and faith. He was the pastor, and he firmly believed that all people were filled with sin, even his own children. And he would terrify his children to the point of tears, describing the hell that awaited them if they didn't repent. Meanwhile, he witnessed Elizabeth contradicting him constantly, defying her own husband, a preacher, by assuring their children that God was good and loving. When she and the children chatted and laughed at the dinner table, he'd become so disgusted over their godlessness and go off by himself to study his Bible. Now, Elizabeth considered herself devout, but she was coming up with new ideas, new ways for her to understand her own faith. As a Presbyterian, there was a lot of stuff happening in that church, the old and the new. And simply put, Theophilus wanted to be part of the old, and Elizabeth wanted to be part of the new. Things came to a breaking point sometime in the spring of 1860 when Elizabeth started spouting off her own opinions in public amidst the members of his congregation. Fearing that he might lose his own flock to his wife, Theophilus realized something had to be done. Thus began his underhanded campaign to have his wife taken away. It wasn't that hard, actually, because at that time, a woman could be diagnosed as insane solely on the testimony of her own husband. There were cases where there might be a trial, similar to the Salem witch trials, but if enough people agreed with Theophilus, his word and the general popular opinion would be enough. He told people his wife suffered from a disease of the mind. And the hardest part for Elizabeth was, well, that was actually true. Years earlier, when Elizabeth was 19, she was admitted to the State Lunatic Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, where she stayed for a total of 6 weeks. At that time, Elizabeth worked as a school principal at a local all-female college. Elizabeth had always been brilliant, and it seemed, at least before she was married, she had the privilege of an excellent education, but it was one that led to her mental downfall. At least that's what the male doctors said. That Elizabeth, like many women who were overeducated, had more or less broken her brain. You see, back then it was believed that the female brain, it was smaller and it had its limits. That a woman like Elizabeth would only absorb so much information before her brain faltered. And the overexertion of a woman's mental labor led to insanity because she'd pushed her brain past its natural limits. The medical experts at the State Lunatic Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, believed that Elizabeth's brain fever, like a high temperature, sensitivity to light, nausea, and disorientation, that they believed it could be caused by any number of feminine issues, from having an irregular period to the dangerous female practice of novel reading. Kate Moore describes this in better detail in her book, but women could be deemed as deranged from the toxic effect of reading too many novels. And naturally, the course of treatment to detoxify a feverish brain was phlebotomy, also known as bloodletting. According to Kate Moore's book, Elizabeth wasn't deranged from breaking her brain from reading too much. Looking back, she appeared to have a legitimate and life-threatening infection, either meningitis or encephalitis. And it's a testimony to her strength, not weakness, that she came out of that place alive. But still, for Elizabeth, the threat of having to go back to another asylum, a place like that, she couldn't bear the thought of it. Not realizing her husband had already put his plan into action. It was earlier that spring when Elizabeth started hearing voices, harsh whispers that followed her, trailed her just loud enough for her to hear. And the words contained in those whispers, well, they were powerful enough to seal her fate and destroy her life. Insane. That she was insane. She did have allies, her own children for starters. One of her teenage sons worked at a local grocer, where he had access to the 800 or so residents in town, those who weren't members of the church, who could lend their support. Overall, Elizabeth was well-liked and more popular than the goon she had as a husband. But Theophilus, he had the law on his side. As a married woman, she was not an individual person. By law, she was part of her husband. And if he said she belonged in a lunatic asylum, that was potentially enough to put her away. His word plus a doctor's note or two, declaring that she was insane, would be ample evidence. But just in case, her husband did gather signatures from around 40 people, men and women, most from his church, who said they'd witnessed Elizabeth's bold declarations about women and equality. And they were willing to testify that they'd seen her defy her husband and God by questioning Bible scripture. Now those allies, those men and women in the town, were her last hope. And she was counting on them to come through for her. But she was running out of time. On June 18th, her once blissful morning was shattered when 4 men descended upon her house, including her husband, a doctor, and the county sheriff. And they were telling her to get dressed. They were taking her to the train station. Elizabeth locked her bedroom door, and when they couldn't get through, they broke through her window using an axe. Terrified, Elizabeth hastily put together a basket full of her things. When they went to the train station, there was indeed a crowd. She hoped that this would be the moment that someone would step forward and announce that she was completely sane and that this was madness. But the prominent local gentlemen, the ones who swore they'd protect her, they stood still and stayed silent out of fear of arrest. Elizabeth wasn't going to go easily. She refused to walk herself onto that train, so she very demurely made herself dead weight, forcing her husband and the other men to make a human chair with their arms, carrying her awkwardly with her giant hoop skirt and all, forcing her onto that train, bound for that Illinois State Hospital in a town called Jacksonville. As the train started to huff and puff, announcing its departure, the only voice Elizabeth heard that day in her defense was another woman from the town, a friend named Rebecca Blessing, who beseeched the men standing there like statues on the platform. She shouted at them all in disbelief. Was there really no man on this platform willing to protect a woman? Rebecca, as a woman herself, was powerless, even putting herself at risk of being declared insane for speaking out. And as the train chugged away, with her husband trapping her inside, she realized she had no protector. There was no one coming to save her. Elizabeth would need to save herself. But how?